Judge Silas Rourke slammed the eviction notice onto the courthouse steps in front of 40 witnesses and smiled. Not the smile of a man doing his job, the smile of a man who enjoyed it. 30 days, he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. After that, I don't care where you take your brats. The widow standing across from him didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just looked at him with those hollow eyes, the kind that come from too many nights, lying awake, doing math that never adds up, and she folded that paper in half without reading it, because she already knew what it said. She'd been waiting for it for 3 months. What Silas Rourke did not know, what none of them knew, was that 3 nights earlier, a half-frozen stranger had collapsed in the snow outside her door. And that stranger was about to change everything. If you've ever had to choose between your pride and your children's survival, you already understand this story. If you haven't, stay with me, because this one will get under your skin. Before we go further, if stories like this are what you come here for, hit that subs button and ring the bell so you never miss one. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The last log split wrong. Mara Vance felt it in her wrists before she heard it, that sick diagonal crack that meant half the wood would burn fast and useless, throwing heat for 20 minutes before collapsing into orange ash. She stood in the frozen yard behind her homestead and looked at the 2 uneven pieces lying in the snow, and she did the math again. Same math she'd been doing every morning for 6 weeks. 4 logs left after this. Maybe 2 days of real heat. 3 if she kept the fire low overnight and piled the children under every blanket she owned. The wind came off the ridge and pushed straight through her coat like the coat wasn't there at all. January in the Montana Territory didn't negotiate. It just arrived and stayed until it was done with you. She picked up both pieces of wood, tucked them under her arm, and went back inside. The front room of the Blackthorn Crossing homestead was small enough that you could cross it in 8 steps. Mara had counted once, during a long night when she couldn't sleep, and needed something to think about that wasn't money. 8 steps from the door to the back wall. The ceiling was low. The windows had gaps around the frames that she'd stuffed with rags in November, and the rags had helped some, but not enough. There was a hook by the door where her husband Daniel's coat still hung. She hadn't moved it. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because the children still touched it sometimes when they walked past, that unconscious brush of fingers against wool, and she didn't have the heart to take that away from them. Tess was at the table with the account book open in front of her, 12 years old, and already she held the pencils the way her father had, tight, like it might escape. She looked up when Mara came in, and something passed between them that didn't need words, but Tess had been watching the woodpile too. Cal's still asleep, Tess said. Good. Let him. Lottie's warm. A pause. Warmer than yesterday, I think. Mara set the wood down beside the stove and didn't answer right away, because she needed a second to let the relief move through her before she could speak calmly. 5. The fever had started 10 days ago, slow at first, the kind you tell yourself is just a chill, just the season, just nothing. Then faster. Then bad enough that Mara had sat beside the girl's cot for 3 nights straight, pressing cold rags to her forehead and bargaining silently with the darkness. Warmer, Mara repeated. Okay, good. She opened the stove and fed one of the split logs in, the better half. The fire accepted it without complaint. Tess watched her mother's back. Are we going to be okay? The honest answer was, I don't know, and that terrifies me more than I will ever tell you. The answer Mara gave was, we're going to be fine. Eat your breakfast. There wasn't much breakfast. There hadn't been much of anything since November, when the tax notice had arrived from the county assessor's office with Judge Silas Rourke's seal pressed into the wax at the bottom. The numbers on that notice had made Mara sit down very slowly in the kitchen chair, pare, and put her face in her hands for exactly 2 minutes. Then she had stood up, washed her face, and started figuring. The assessment on the Blackthorn Crossing property had nearly doubled from the previous year. 160 acres of working land, the barn, the house, the water rights. Daniel had filed the original claim 4 years ago, cleared the trees on the east slope himself, dug the irrigation channel by hand over 2 summers. He had died of a chest infection 17 months later, leaving Mara with 3 children, a half-finished ranch, an old bank loan, and 18 in paper money that she kept folded inside her mother's Bible because she didn't entirely trust the local bank. $18. Against a tax bill that had no business being what it was. She had gone to see Rourke herself that first week because she was not a woman who sent letters when she could speak plainly. She had put on her good coat, the one without the torn lining, and driven the buckboard into town and walked into the county offices and asked to see the judge. The clerk had made her wait 40 minutes on a wooden bench. When Rourke finally appeared, he had looked at her the way men like him look at widows, with a specific kind of patience that is really just contempt wearing better clothes. She had explained the situation, the previous assessment, the discrepancy, the fact that the land hadn't changed, the improvements hadn't changed, that nothing justified numbers this large. Rourke had listened. He had nodded several times. He had said he understood her concern, that the county was simply applying consistent standards across all properties, that she was welcome to file a written appeal with the assessor's office, which was located in the building directly next door, and that the appeal process typically took between 4 and 6 months. The auction on delinquent properties, he added pleasantly, was scheduled for December 23rd. Mara had driven home and done the math 17 different ways and come up with the same answer every time. She had exactly 18. She needed several hundred. The appeal would take longer than she had. The bank loan, the one Daniel had taken to buy seed and fencing supplies the first year, had a balloon clause she hadn't understood when she'd signed the extension after his death, and it was coming due in February. She had 2 months, and no way out that she could see. She hadn't told Tess the specifics. Tess was 12, not an adult, and Mara was stubborn about that line in a way that probably wasn't entirely rational. But children who grow up on homesteads absorb numbers the same way they absorb weather through their skin without being taught. Tess knew it was bad. She'd stopped asking for things back in October. She'd started eating less, serving herself smaller portions at meals. And Mara had only noticed the pattern 2 weeks ago when she'd watched the girl quietly push half her dinner toward Cal's plate when she thought no one was looking. That had broken something small and essential inside Mara that she hadn't managed to repair yet. Cal was 8. He'd taken his father's death differently, not with grief that you could see in its recess, but with a strange, hardened seriousness that sat wrong on an 8-year-old's face. He'd started sleeping with Daniel's old framing hammer beside him in the cot. When Mara had asked him why, he'd looked at her with those serious brown eyes and said, "Somebody has to protect us." She hadn't argued. She'd just kissed his forehead and told him he was right, and then she'd gone to the barn and stood in the cold for 10 minutes. Because she didn't want any of them to see her face. That was the situation at Blackthorn Crossing on the night of January 14th, 1887. 3 children, 1 log burning in the stove, $18 in a Bible, and a tax notice with Silas Rourke's seal on it sitting on the kitchen shelf like a quiet, patient threat. The knock on the door came just after dark. Mara almost didn't hear it. The wind was up. It had been building all afternoon, and by evening it was coming off the mountains with real intent, the kind of cold that turns your breath to steam before it's left your mouth. She was at the stove, heating the last of the bean soup when she heard it, or thought she heard it. She stood still and waited. It came again. Not a knock exactly, more like something hitting the door. Once, then silence. She took the iron poker from beside the stove before she opened it, because she was a practical woman, and the territory at night was not a place for assumptions. What was on the other side of the door was not a threat. It was a man on his knees in the snow, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe, head down, breath coming in shallow visible bursts. He wore a canvas duster that might have been brown once, but was now mostly ice. His hat had fallen somewhere behind him in the yard. There was blood on the left side of his coat, not fresh, the kind that had soaked through and frozen, and soaked through again, and his skin, what she could see of it, the color of old candle wax. He looked up at her. His eyes were dark brown, slightly unfocused, but trying to fix on her face with something that was almost dignity, like he was embarrassed to be found like this. "Sorry," he said. His voice came out rough and thin. "I saw the light." He had a good face. That was the first thing she noticed, and she felt faintly ridiculous for noticing it, given that he was bleeding in her doorway. Square jaw, a few days of dark stubble, lines around his eyes that came from squinting into distance and wind, not from age. Mid-30s, maybe. He had the hands of someone who worked she could see the knuckles, split and rough, even in the dark. He started to say something else, and then his arm gave out and he listed sideways against the doorframe. Mara caught him by the coat. She was stronger than she looked. Years of hauling water and splitting wood and managing livestock will do that, and she got an arm under his shoulder and pulled him upright before he went down. "Get your feet under you," she said. "I'm trying. Try harder." It took 3 full minutes to get him through the door. He was tall and heavier than he appeared, or maybe just dense with cold, and he wasn't unconscious, but wasn't far from it either. And Mara had to navigate him around the corner of the doorframe and across the 8 steps to the chair beside the stove without knocking anything over. She managed it. Mostly. Tess appeared in the doorway to the back room, eyes wide. "Get a blanket," Mara said. "Not one of Lottie's, the brown one from the trunk. Who is he?" "I don't know." "Blanket Tess now." She got his coat off. The shirt beneath it was flannel, dark gray, and the left side was soaked through with blood that had mostly dried. The wound, when she opened his shirt to look at it, was a deep gash along his left side, not a knife wound. She didn't think, more like something jagged, maybe a fence post or a broken branch, the kind of tearing injury you get when a horse throws you somewhere bad. It had been bleeding for a while, and someone had made a rough attempt to bandage it with what looked like a strip of shirt, which had done almost nothing. She cleaned it with the last of the whiskey Daniel had left in the barn. The man made a sound through his teeth, but didn't flinch away. "You're not going to faint on me," she said. It was not a question. "No, ma'am, good. I've got enough problems." Something shifted in his expression at that something that might have been, in a different moment, a small, tired laugh. Tess brought the blanket. Cal appeared behind her, hammer in hand, staring at the stranger with narrow eyes that Mara would have found amusing if she hadn't also found them heartbreaking. She sent them both back to bed. It took 2 firm repetitions and 1 direct look, and then she finished bandaging the man's side with strips cut from a feed sack, which was not ideal, but was what she had. When she was done, he was sitting upright in the chair with the brown blanket around his shoulders, and some color had come back into his face. "Not much. But some. You need to eat something," she said. "You don't have to. I didn't ask if I had to." She went to the stove and ladled bean soup into the bowl she'd planning to use for her own supper. She handed it to him. He took it with both hands and held it for a moment, like the warmth itself was the thing he needed most, which it probably was. "Thank you," he said. He meant it. She could tell the difference. "What's your name?" A beat. Just a half second. Too long. "Rowan. Rowan Hale. Where are you coming from, Rowan Hale?" "North." He paused. There was a horse. "I had a horse. Came down wrong on the ice, out near the ridge. Couldn't. I left her." He said it flatly, but something moved behind his eyes. A man who cared about his horse. She filed that away. "How long were you out in it?" "A few hours. Maybe more." He looked at the soup and then back at her. "I'll be gone in the morning. I don't want to be a burden to you." "You're already a burden," Mara said without heat. "Might as well eat first." She went to check on Lottie, who was sleeping soundly, the faint color in her cheeks closer to pink than gray tonight. Small mercy. She stood at the cot for a moment, listening to her daughter breathe, then went back to the front room. The stranger, Rowan, had eaten the soup. He was sitting very still, both hands wrapped around the empty bowl, staring at the stove with the particular 1,000-yard look of a man working something out in his head. He didn't hear her come back in immediately, and in that unguarded moment, she saw something in his face she hadn't caught before. Not pain from the wound. Something older. Something that had been there before the ice and the horse and the blood. She pulled up the other chair across from him and sat down. "You picked a bad spot to get lost," she said. "I've noticed. Nobody lives within 4 miles of here except old Ada Crowley, and she would have shot at you before she opened the door." Mara folded her hands in her lap. "You're safe for tonight. The spare cot is in the back. I'll put you in there once you can walk steadily. In the morning, if you can get to town, there's a doctor." "I've had worse," he said. "That is not the reassuring statement you think it is." This time he did almost smile. It changed his face considerably. "I'll pay you," he said. "For the food." "The trouble." "With what?" "You didn't exactly arrive with saddlebags." Something moved across his face then quickly, gone in half a second, but Mara was watching, and she caught it. Not embarrassment, not shame. Something more deliberate, like a door closing. I'll figure something out, he said. She let it sit there between them. She was good at silence. Daniel had always said she weaponized it, which wasn't entirely wrong. She helped him to the back cot an hour later. He walked on his own, barely, one hand on the wall. She showed him where the bucket was. She left him a candle stub. At the door she turned back. In the morning, she said, "Tell me who you actually are." He looked at her from the cot, one arm thrown over his eyes. "I told you my name." "You told me a name," she said. "There's a difference." She closed the door and went back to her chair by the stove and sat in the dark for a long time. The fire was low. She didn't add another log. She just sat and listened to the wind move around the corners of the house. And she thought about the tax notice on the shelf and the 18 in the Bible and the way that man's face had closed down when she'd mentioned payment. She didn't sleep until almost 3 in the morning. And when she finally did, she dreamed of nothing, which was the best she could hope for. She found it the next morning when she went to check on him. He was still asleep, more asleep than a man ought to be. At 6 in the morning, the heavy, unconscious sleep of someone the body has finally forced under. And his coat was hung over the chair beside the cot where she'd left it the night before, and the inside pocket had come open with the weight of it. She wasn't trying to look. She genuinely wasn't. She was reaching for the coat to feel the lining, checking whether it was dry enough to put back on him, and that's when she saw it. Gold, heavy gold, engraved on the case on a chain that was far too fine for a wandering laborer. Pocket watch, the kind that cost more than most men in this territory made in 6 months. Mara stood very still for a moment. Then she set the coat back on the chair without touching the watch, and she walked to the front room. And she stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard, and the frozen fence posts, and the pile of wood that wasn't going to last another 2 days. The man sleeping in her back room was not who he said he was, and she had fed him the last of her soup. She stood at that window for a long time, not because she didn't know what to do. Mara Vance had always known what to do. That had been both her greatest strength and the thing that exhausted her most. That relentless clarity, that inability to pretend a problem wasn't there just because looking at it hurt. She stood at the window because she needed a minute to be angry before she went back in there and acted like a reasonable person. A gold watch, engraved, heavy enough that it had pulled the coat pocket out of shape. She thought about the soup. The last of it, scraped from the bottom of the pot, the beans she'd been rationing since December. She thought about Tess pushing food toward Cal's plate when she thought no one was watching. She thought about the wood situation and the tax notice and the 18 in the Bible and the fact that she had given this man, this stranger, with careful half-answers and his deliberate silences, the food out of her children's mouths. And he had a gold watch in his pocket. She breathed out slow through her nose. The window glass was cold against her forehead when she leaned her face toward it. Outside, the snow was smooth and unbroken all the way to the fence line, pale blue in the early morning light, and somewhere past the ridge, a hawk was circling something patient and invisible. She pushed off the window and went to start the fire properly. She didn't say anything to him when he came out. That was deliberate. She had learned maids and 3 children, over years of marriage and 3 children, and too many conversations where she'd led with her anger and watched the whole thing go sideways, that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was wait. Let the other person fill the silence. Let them build their own rope. He came out of the back room around 7, moving carefully, one hand not quite touching the wall, but trekking it anyway, the way you do when you're not sure your legs have entirely remembered how to work. He was pale but upright. Someone had clearly been stubborn about that even in private. "Morning," he said. "Coffee's on the stove," Mara said without turning from the pan. "Sit down before you fall down." He sat. She heard the chair take his weight, heard him pour the coffee with a hand that was slightly unsteady. She made the eggs. There were only 4 left. She used 3 of them, put 2 on a plate for him, and took one for herself, and set the plate in front of him, and set the plate in front of him, and sat across the table and watched him eat. He ate like a man who'd been ignoring hunger for several days. Not fast, not sloppy, but with the kind of focus that goes beyond normal appetite. He was more than halfway through before he seemed to register he was being watched. He looked up. Mara put her coffee cup down. "Tell me about the watch," she said. Whatever he'd been expecting her to say, it wasn't that. She saw it hit him, the slight tension across the shoulders, the way his jaw settled differently. He didn't look away, though. She gave him credit for that. "You went through my coat," he said. Not accusatory, just careful. "I was checking the lining. To see if it was dry." She met his eyes. "I wasn't looking for it, but I found it." A long pause. He set his fork down on the plate. "It was my father's," he said. "That's not an answer to what I'm asking." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Outside, Cal's voice carried from the yard. He'd gotten up early and gone to check on the animals without being asked, because he did that now, had been doing it since his father died, this 8-year-old boy who'd decided someone had to hold the rope. Mara heard him talking to the 2 remaining milk cows in that low, serious tone he used with animals. She kept her eyes on the man across the table. "Rowan Hale," she said, and she said it the way you say a name when you're testing whether it fits. "That's a real name?" "It's my real name, but not the whole story." He looked at his coffee for a moment. Then he looked back up at her, and something shifted in his face, not quite a decision, more like the moment just before one. "No," he said quietly, "not the whole story. I've got 3 children in this house and enough trouble to last me the next 10 years, Mara said. "I don't have the patience for a man who gives me half answers and expects me to be grateful for them. You want to stay through today, through your wound healing enough that you won't fall down in the snow 20 yards. From my door, I need to know who you are." He was quiet for a beat that stretched out long enough that she almost pushed back her chair. Then he said, "Rowan Elias Hale. Until about 8 months ago, I owned the Hale Cattle Company out of Billings. 43,000 acres, 800 head, 15 full-time ranch hands, and a payroll that ran to—" He stopped, rubbed the side of his jaw with one hand. "It doesn't matter what the payroll ran to. Point is I had it, and then I didn't." Mara didn't move. "What happened?" "My business partner happened." The words came out flat and even, which she recognized as the tone of a man who had already burned through all his rage on this particular subject, and come out the other side into something cooler and emptier. "Man named Garrett Purcell. We'd built the operation together over 12 years. I trusted him completely." He said the last 3 words like they were a diagnosis. He'd been systematically moving money out of the company accounts for the better part of 2 years. Paying off my debts with it, or what he told me were my debts. Turned out he'd been taking loans in my name, putting the collateral up without my knowledge, letting the interest compound while I thought everything was settled. A pause. By the time I figured it out, the company was buried under obligations I hadn't known existed. I could fight it in court for 3 years and maybe win, or I could liquidate and walk away with something. "How much?" Mara asked, because she was not a woman who danced around numbers. He looked at her steadily. $12,000. The number Fata set on the table between them like something physical. $12,000. Against her 18. Against her tax bill and her bank loan and her wood that wasn't going to last 2 more days. She felt the anger move through her again, sharp and clean. "You have $12,000, she said, "and you were sleeping in the snow. I wasn't trying to— You have $12,000, and I fed you the last of my beans. Mrs. Vance, do not Mrs. Vance me right now." She stood up from the table and took her plate to the wash basin and stood there with her back to him, because she needed 6 seconds to set herself in hand before she said something she didn't actually mean. She breathed twice. Then she turned around. He was watching her with an expression that was not defensive and was not ashamed, exactly, but was something complicated that she didn't quite have a name for yet. "I wasn't hiding from you specifically," he said. I haven't told anyone. I don't know how to explain this without sounding like I've lost my mind." "Try." Another pause. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "After Purcell, after I found out what he'd done, I kept thinking about all the people in my life who'd been around me when I had the operation. All the hands, the buyers, the neighbors, the people I thought were friends." He stopped. "And I kept asking myself how many of them would have been there if I'd had nothing. And I couldn't answer it. I didn't trust my own judgment anymore, not after missing what Purcell was doing right in front of me for 2 years." He set the cup down. "So I walked away, put the money in a bank in Denver, took a horse and some supplies, and started going west. I wanted to—" He stopped again, and this time the pause was different, more internal. "I wanted to see if I could find someone who would help a man who had nothing to offer them." Mara stared at him. That's what you were doing, she said slowly. Testing people. Not, he shook his head. Not testing. More like looking for proof that it still existed. I didn't expect to nearly die in the process. You were looking for proof, she repeated. And meanwhile, people in this territory are losing their land and their livelihoods, and you were wandering around with $12,000 in a Denver bank playing. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Get some rest, she said. Your wound needs 2 more days before you can travel, and I can't carry you if you go down in the yard. We'll talk more later. She went outside before he could respond. The cold was clarifying. It was the thing she'd always respected about Montana winters. They didn't allow you to wallow. You could be furious and devastated and exhausted, but the cold required your attention, which meant you couldn't fully collapse. She stood in the yard and breathed and looked at the woodpile and reminded herself what was actually important. Lottie's fever, Tess and the meals she wasn't eating, Cal with his hammer, the tax notice, December 23rd. That was what was important. Not the rage she felt toward a man who'd had a golden watch in his pocket while she fed him her last beans. She went to the barn. The 2 cows were calm. Cal sitting on a hay bale between them with his arms crossed. She watching them with proprietary seriousness. He looked up when she came in. The brown one's not eating right, he announced. I know. She's been off since last week. Mara, check the water. You been out here long? Since light. You eat breakfast? A short pause. Yes. She looked at him. He held the look, which meant he was telling the truth. Some of the tension in her chest eased slightly. There's a man in the house, Cal said. I know. I put him there. I saw him last night. He studied her face. Trouble? 8 years old, and the word he reached for was trouble. Danger? Not scary. Not anything a child ought to be reaching for. Trouble. Like a man doing risk assessment. No, Mara said. And she said it firmly because she believed it was true, even now, even angry. Whatever Rowan Hale was doing or wasn't doing, she didn't think he was trouble in that sense. He's hurt, and he needed help. That's all. Cal considered this with the gravity he gave all information. Okay, he said finally. She spent the rest of the morning doing what the morning required, feeding the animals, checking the ice on the water trough, going through the pantry and tallying what remained with the same careful math she did every few days, the math that never came out right but that she kept doing anyway because not knowing was worse. She counted the flour, the salt, the 3 remaining jars of preserved tomatoes, the cornmeal. She counted the days until town, which she couldn't go to until the weather broke, which it showed no sign of doing. She went in at noon and found the front room empty. Her first thought was that he'd left, and she was surprised by how sharply she didn't want that to be true. Not for his sake, not yet, but because she hadn't finished being angry at him, and an unfinished anger was its own kind of burden. Then she heard sounds from outside, around the back of the house. She went around the corner and stopped. He was at the woodpile, or what had been the woodpile. He'd found Daniel's splitting maul she'd left it, leaning against the fence since October, hadn't been able to make herself move it, and he had apparently been at it for some time, because there was a substantial stack of split wood beside him, clean even pieces that would burn long and well, and he was setting up another round on the block, with movements that were slightly too careful on his left side, compensating for the wound, but steady. He split the round, bent to pick up the pieces, set another. Mara watched him for a moment. You're going to tear that bandage open, she said. He didn't stop. Probably. I just put that bandage on. I know. He split the next round. I'll try not to bleed on anything important. She should have told him to stop. She almost did. Instead, she stood there in the cold, and once watched she stood there another 4 rounds before she went back inside, and she didn't examine too carefully why she didn't say anything else. By mid-afternoon, Lottie was worse again. It came on fast, the way fevers do with small children 1 hour fine, the next burning. Mara felt her daughter's forehead and her stomach dropped. Not as bad as it had been at the worst of it, but bad enough. She needed willow bark. She'd known for 3 days she needed more willow bark. She'd used the last of what she had on the 9th day of the fever, and the roots of the old willow on the creek edge were under 2 feet of frozen ground. There was another willow stand. She knew, about 1.5 miles north along the ridge, near the old beaver pond. She'd been trying not to think about it, because a mile and a half in this cold, breaking trail through knee-deep snow was a serious undertaking. She was getting her coat when Rowan appeared in the doorway. "Where are you going?" he asked. "North." She pulled the coat on. "There's a willow stand near the beaver pond. I need bark for my daughter." He looked at her, then at the window, where the light was already going, thin and pale, in that way it did at 3 in the afternoon in January. "It'll be dark in 2 hours, I know. I'll go." She turned to look at him. He was still in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and he looked like a man who should absolutely not be walking a mile and a half through deep snow with a wound in his side. He also looked like a man who was going to say what he was going to say regardless. "You know where the stand is?" she asked. "I know beaver ponds and willow stands. I spent 12 years running cattle in country like this." He met her eyes. "Tell me the landmarks. You'll tear that bandage. You keep saying that like it's going to change anything." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him the landmarks. He came back 2.5 hours later, after dark had fully fallen. Shinatsu was sitting beside Lottie's cot, trying to keep her voice even while she told her youngest daughter a story about a girl who found a river made of stars, which was the story she always told when she had nothing else to offer. He came in through the front door with a bundle of willow bark wrapped in a coat, and he was limping badly, and there was a new dark stain on his shirt that she was going to have to look at. But he had the bark. He set it on the table and sat down heavily in the chair, and Mara stood up from beside Lottie's cot and went to him and unwrapped the coat and looked at his side. "You tore it," she said. "Little bit." "That is not a little bit. It'll close again." She worked on it without speaking, cleaned it, rebandaged it, cut the new strips from the same feed sack material because she still didn't have anything better. He sat still and didn't make a sound, though she knew it hurt because she could see it in the line of his jaw. When she was done, she went and made the willow bark tea and brought it to Lottie and sat with her while the girl drank it. Slow, careful sips, making a face at the bitterness that made Mara's chest ache with tenderness. By 9 o'clock, the fever was dropping. She came back out to the front room and stood in the doorway. Rowan was still in the chair, eyes half open, looking at the stove. He'd added a log without being asked, she noticed. The room was warmer than it had been all day. "She's better," Mara said. "Good," he said. "Just that." She sat in the other chair, across from him, and for a while they didn't say anything at all. Fire moved in the stove. Outside, the wind was lower than it had been. Just a low sound now, a pressure rather than a howl. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know. I wasn't asking you to. I know that too." He looked at her sideways. "Did you want me to not do it?" She thought about it honestly, which she believed was the only useful way to think about anything. "No," she said. "Then let's leave it there." They sat in the quiet a little longer. The log he'd added settled in the stove with a soft sound. "Tell me about the debt," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to," he added, "but I've got 2 more days before I can reasonably travel, and you've got a problem that looks a lot like the kind I know something about. So tell me or don't." "But I'm asking." It had been so long since anyone had asked. Actually asked, without the particular kind of pity that made her want to refuse on principle, without the assumption that she was defeated, without the subtext of, "and maybe you should just move into town." He asked it the way someone asks about a fence line or a water source, like it was practical information. Like he believed she was a person capable of holding a serious conversation about a serious problem. She told him about the assessment, about Rourke, about the numbers and the timeline and the 18 in the Bible and the bank loan, with the clause she hadn't understood when she'd signed it. She told him about going to see Rourke and sitting on that bench for 40 minutes, and the way he'd smiled when he told her about the appeal process and the December 23rd auction. She told him about Daniel Not Everything, not the grief of it, but the practical shape of it, the claim, the work, the loan, the death, what he'd left behind and what it had meant, and what she'd been trying to do with it since. Rowan listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions while she was still talking, didn't make the face men sometimes made when a woman explained a financial situation, that particular expression of polite skepticism. He just listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Rourke," he said. "He's the county judge?"
"Yes."
"And he set the assessment himself?" "His office did. Same office that runs the auction. And the bank loan who holds the note." First Territorial Bank, branch in town. She looked at him. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the stove again with that same distant expression she'd caught the night before, the one that meant something was moving behind his eyes. You said other settlers have been losing land, that it's happened before. 3 families I know of in the past 2 years. The Hendersons, the Garrity Place, old Walt Bauer. All of them had assessments that went up, fell behind, lost the auction. And who bought at those auctions? Mara opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She'd never actually asked that. She'd heard about the losses Ada Crowley had told her, about the Hendersons, and she'd known the Garritys slightly, but she hadn't thought to ask who had ended up with the land afterward. I don't know, she said. Something in Rowan's expression shifted, subtly. That's a question worth answering, he said. You think there's a pattern? I think patterns are usually there if you look for them. He glanced at her. I spent 12 years in business before I understood that the people who steal the most do it in plain sight, with paperwork that looks exactly like how things are supposed to work. Purcell didn't hide what he was doing, he just made it boring. Routine. Something you stop looking at after a while because it always looks the same. A pause. If Rourke is doing what I think he might be doing, he's been doing it slowly, consistently, for years. One property at a time, small enough that nobody connects them. Mara felt something cold and specific move through her, and it wasn't the weather. You're saying he's doing it on purpose, she said. I'm saying the question is worth asking. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing. The fire was steady. You said you have $12,000, she said slowly. In a bank in Denver, yes. And you know cattle and land. And apparently, you know something about corrupt business practices. He looked at her carefully, like he wasn't sure she was going. I'm not interested in your money, Mara said. I want to be clear about that right now. I'm not going to be one of your experiments or your charity cases. My land is not a place for someone to come and prove a point about human kindness and then move on. She held his gaze steadily. But I'm also not stupid, and I'm not so proud that I can't recognize when a problem is bigger than one person. If Rourke is doing what you think he's doing, then the problem isn't mine. It's everybody's. And everybody solving it together is not the same thing as accepting charity. He was quiet for a long moment. What are you proposing, he said. Nothing yet, Mara said. You've been here 2 days. I don't make proposals to men I've known 2 days. She stood up from the chair. But I'm thinking about it. And I think you should think about it too. She went to check on Lottie one more time. Her daughter was sleeping, the fever down, her small face relaxed into something that looked like ordinary rest. Mara adjusted the blanket, stood there in the dark for a moment. When she came back through, Rowan was still in the chair. His eyes were closed, whether in thought or the first edges of sleep, she couldn't tell. She took the other chair and sat back down. They stayed like that, the two of them, in the quiet and the firelight, with the wind gone and the snow outside holding still and the stove doing its slow and reliable work, not speaking, not needing to. It was the most company Mara had felt in 17 months. She hated how much it mattered. The next 4 days passed in a specific and unrepeatable way that Mara would think about later with the mixed feeling of something that had been both harder and better than she'd expected. Rowan didn't leave at the 2-day mark, and she didn't ask him to, and neither of them discussed this directly because there was enough to discuss that was practical and immediate. He split wood every morning, regardless of what she said about his side. She rebandaged it every evening, regardless of what he said about not needing it. This became, without either of them naming it, a kind of rhythm. He was good with Cal, which she hadn't expected. Not in the performed, look at me being good, with children way that some men did. That self-conscious gentleness that children always see through immediately. He was just straightforward with him. Talked to him like a person. Asked his opinion about the brown cow that wasn't eating right. Cal had ideas about it, specific and detailed ideas, and Rowan listened to all of them and then said, I think you're right about the feed quality. Let me look at what you've got, and then actually looked at it and agreed with Cal's diagnosis, which turned out to be accurate. After that, Cal left the hammer in the house when he went to the barn. Mara noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Tess was a different matter. Tess watched Rowan with the particular precise suspicion of a 12-year-old girl who had decided at some point in the last 17 months that she was responsible for noticing things her mother might miss. She watched him the way you watch something you're not sure is what it appears to be. She didn't ask him direct questions, but she listened to everything he said, and she made small tests asking questions she already knew the answer to about cattle or weather or fence posts to see if his answers were consistent. They were. On the third day, she came to Mara in the barn and said, without preamble, he knows what he's talking about. I know, Mara said. That doesn't mean he's trustworthy. I know that too. Tess chewed this over for a second. But you think he might be. Mara kept her eyes on the milk she was drawing. I think trustworthy is something you measure over time, not something you decide about. That's not a yes or a no. No, Mara agreed, it isn't. Tess went back to the house, apparently satisfied with this, and Mara let out a long breath into the cold barn air and stared at the cow's flank for a moment. She was thinking about Rourke. She'd been thinking about Rourke constantly since Rowan had asked who bought the land at the auction, and the question had gotten under her skin the way a splinter does small, persistent, impossible to stop pressing at. She'd sent Ada Crowley 2 days ago when the weather had broken just long enough for her to get a rider to the crossroads, asking Ada what she knew about the Henderson and Garrity land. Who had it now? What the transaction had looked like. She hadn't told Rowan she'd done this. She wasn't entirely sure why. On the 5th morning, he sat down at the kitchen table while she was making breakfast and said, I need to tell you something I should have told you 3 days ago. She set the pan down and waited. I know Rursk's name, Rowan said. Not personally, but I've heard it. Before I came through here, I spent 2 weeks in a town called Halcyon, about 40 miles east, and there were men there who'd lost land in this county. I didn't pay enough attention at the time. He stopped. I was thinking about myself, my own situation. I heard them talking, and I didn't ask the right questions. Mara looked at him. And now you think you should have. Yes. Why are you telling me this? He met her eyes. Because you've been straight with me from the beginning, and I've been giving you pieces when I should have been giving you the whole thing. And because, a pause. Because whatever you're building here, whatever you're trying to hold on to, it deserves more than pieces. The fire in the stove cracked. Lottie was humming something in the back room, some song she'd invented herself with no discernible melody, but great personal conviction. Outside, Cal's voice, talking to the cows. Mara picked the pan back up. After breakfast, she said, we're going to sit down, and you're going to tell me everything you remember about what those men said in Halcyon, all right? And then I'm going to tell you about a letter I sent to Ada Crowley. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but something close to it, like he was recalibrating. You've already been working on this, he said. I've been working on this since the day I got the notice, Mara said. I just didn't have the right pieces yet. She put the eggs on his plate, and then on hers, and then she sat down across from him. Now, she said, let's talk about Silas Rourke. Ada Crowley's letter arrived on a Tuesday, brought by the Garrity boy, who was 12 and half frozen and happy enough to accept a biscuit and a warm seat by the fire before heading back out. Mara read it, standing at the kitchen table, while Rowan poured coffee and pretended not to watch her face. The letter was 3 pages, written in Ada's cramped, slanted hand that pressed hard enough into the paper that you could feel the impressions on the back. Most of its windows were dark. Ada was 71 years old and had been homesteading in this territory since before most people in the county had been born, and she wrote the way she talked direct, no decoration, and with a specific kind of anger that had been refined by decades into something almost surgical. Mara read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it down on the table and stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Well, she said, Rowan didn't ask, he waited. The Henderson land, Mara said. Sold at auction November of 1885. Bought by a company called Crescent Land Holdings for $62. She looked up. 140 acres of improved land with a working well and a barn for $62. That's not a price, Rowan said. That's a formality. And the Garrity place. 80 acres, water rights on the South Creek. Auction March of '86. Purchased by a company called Northern Slope Properties for $49. Rowan set his coffee cup down, and Walt Bauer, Mara continued. His 200 acres went in July. A company called Clearwater Land Trust paid $81. She picked the letter up again. Ada looked into all three companies. She knows a man at the land registry office in the territorial capital. She doesn't say how she knows him, and I've known Ada long enough not to ask. Crescent Land Holdings, Northern Slope Properties, and Clearwater Land Trust all share the same registered agent, a man named Ellis Croft. She paused. Ellis Croft is the brother-in-law of Judge Silas Rourke. The kitchen was very quiet. Cal was in the barn. Tess was in the back room with Lottie, doing lessons from the one McGuffey reader they owned. The fire was burning low and needed a log, but neither of them moved to add one. He's running a circuit, Rowan said. His voice was very even, the same flat evenness she'd heard when he talked about Purcell. He inflates the assessments, forces the auction, makes sure the only bidder is one of his family's shell companies, and buys the land at whatever number he wants. Then he holds it or resells it at full value. And he's been doing it for at least 2 years, Mara said. 3 families that Ada knows of. There are probably more. Almost certainly more. Rowan looked at her. And your land, Blackthorn Crossing, what makes it worth his particular attention? That was the question she'd been turning over since she'd first gotten the notice. 160 acres was not the largest claim in the county. She had the water rights on the north branch of the creek, and the eastern pasture was good grass. But there were better spreads. She'd never fully understood why her assessment had jumped the way it had. The creek access, she said slowly. Daniel filed the water rights separately when he claimed. He did it right, the whole legal process. I have documented rights to the north branch all the way from the ridge to the lower pasture. She looked at Rowan. If someone owned the land on both sides of that branch, they'd control the water for half the valley. Rowan finished. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee, realized it had gone cold, and set it back down. You need a lawyer, he said. I need a miracle's what I need. Those aren't actually different things when the lawyer is good enough. He looked at her directly. I know a man in Denver, Gideon Mercer. He's a territorial law specialist. He's the one who helped me untangle what Purcell did. He found 3 things in that mess that I'd missed entirely, things that let me walk away with considerably more than I would have otherwise. A pause. He's expensive. I don't have expensive. I know. I'm not saying you pay for him. Mara's jaw tightened. Rowan, before you say no, hear me out. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and there was nothing soft or apologetic about his posture. He wasn't pleading. He was making an argument. I've got $12,000 sitting in a bank in Denver doing nothing except making me feel like I solved a problem that I didn't actually solve. If Rourke is running a scheme that's taken land from multiple families, that's not just your problem that's a territorial crime. A lawyer who can build that case isn't charity. It's what the money is for. I just didn't know that until I got here. That's a very convenient reason. Maybe. He held her gaze. Doesn't make it wrong. She stood up from the table and went to the window. The yard was empty. Just the snow and the fence posts and the gray winter sky that looked like it was thinking about delivering more weather. She thought of Rourke sitting behind his desk with his pleasant expression and his auction schedule and his brother-in-law's shell companies taking land one family at a time, each one too broke and too isolated and too scared to do anything about it. She thought about Daniel, who had spent 2 summers digging that irrigation channel by hand. I'll give you my answer by tomorrow, she said. That's fair. And if the answer is yes, I want terms. Written terms. Equal partnership in whatever this becomes. My land, my labor, my knowledge of this valley and these people that counts as much as your money and your lawyer. Nobody owns anybody. Nobody gets to make decisions for the other person. And if it goes wrong, we split whatever's left equally and go separate ways. She turned from the window to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not admiration exactly. Something more surprised than that. You've been thinking about the terms, he said. I've been thinking about the terms since the morning after I found the watch, she said. I don't know why you look surprised. He almost smiled. I don't know why either. She gave him her answer the next morning before breakfast, standing in the kitchen with her coat still on because she'd just come in from the barn and she'd made the vaginal incision somewhere between the door of the house and the door of the barn and hadn't wanted to wait. Yes, she said. On my terms, on your terms, he agreed. We need to move fast. The auction is December 23rd. That's, she counted, 19 days. I can get to Denver in 4 days if the weather holds. Mercer can be here in another 5 or 6. Ada Crowley has been talking to displaced families. I want her involved. She's got connections in this county that go back 20 years, and a temper that would stop a freight train. Ada Crowley sounds like exactly what we need, Rowan said. She's also 71 and doesn't like strangers. I'll be respectful. You'd better be more than respectful. She once threatened a land surveyor with a fence post for looking at her east pasture sideways. Mara poured coffee for both of them. She'll trust you if I tell her to, but she'll verify everything you say, and she won't pretend otherwise. Don't waste her time. Understood. They sat down across from each other, and for the next 3 hours they mapped out what they knew, what they needed to know, and what had to happen before December 23rd. Mara wrote it down in the same account book where Tess had been tallying food stores, on the blank pages in the back, in her careful, angular handwriting. The list was long and specific and somewhat terrifying in its specificity. Rowan left the next morning. He got up before dawn, packed what he had, which wasn't much. Most of his gear had gone down with the horse borrowed one of Daniel's old coats from the hook by the door, which Mara had taken down herself and held for a moment before handing to him without a word. Cal had come out of the back room to watch him go, still in his nightclothes, and Rowan had crouched down to the boy's level and said, I need you to look after things here. You and your sister Tess. Keep the firewood up, and watch the brown cow, she's still not right on the feed. Cal had looked at him with that serious brown-eyed stare. When are you coming back? Soon as I can, that's not a specific answer. No, Rowan said. It isn't. I'll be back before December 23rd. I promise you that. Cal had thought about it. Then he'd nodded. Once, the way he nodded about things he'd decided to accept. Mara had walked Rowan to the gate. She hadn't intended to. She just found herself doing it. At the gate, he stopped and looked at her. The sky was still dark, just a thin pale line starting on the eastern ridge. I'll be back, he said. I know. She said it matter-of-factly, because she'd decided she believed it, and she'd also decided she wasn't going to perform uncertainty just because it would have seemed more appropriate. She was past appropriate. Mara. He said her name for the first time. Just that. She met his eyes. Something passed between them that neither of them was ready to name, partly because there wasn't time, and partly because they were both people who had been badly wrong about trust before and were not eager to be wrong again. Go get the lawyer, she said. He went. The 9 days that followed were simultaneously the most productive and the most grueling stretch Mara had lived through since the weeks right after Daniel died, when she'd had to manage grief and logistics at the time, and found that the logistics were actually easier to hold because they gave the grief somewhere to go. She drove the buckboard to Ada Crowley's place the very next day, wrapped in every layer she owned, with Tess sitting beside her because she'd decided that Tess was old enough to be part of this, and because Tess had a mind that she'd been underusing by trying to protect it. Ada Crowley's homestead was 4 miles north on land that looked like it had decided long ago to grow exactly what Ada wanted it to grow and nothing else. The house was solid and low, built by Ada's late husband Franklin in 1861, and there was a large dog of indeterminate origin sitting on the porch who watched their approach with the focused attention of a creature whose primary purpose in life was deciding who constituted a threat. Ada came out before they'd tied off the horse. She was a small woman who gave the impression of being much larger, white hair, cut practically short, and eyes that were bright and sharp, and currently assessing Mara with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been reading people's situations for 7 decades. You look like you've got news, Ada said. I've got news and a plan, Mara said, and I need your help with both. Ada looked at Tess. Who's this? My daughter, Tess? She know how to keep her mouth shut when it's not her turn to talk. Tess, to her credit, met Ada's gaze directly. Yes, ma'am. Ada looked at her for another 2 seconds, then nodded. Come in, then. Coffee's on. They were inside for 4 hours. Mara told Ada everything: the watch, the conversation, the letter Ada herself had written, and what they'd built on top of it. She told her about Rowan Hale, all of it, the money and the partner, and what she'd worked out about the water rights, and why Rourke had targeted Blackthorn Crossing specifically. She told her about the lawyer coming from Denver, and what she hoped to accomplish before December 23rd. Ada listened to all of it, The same way, Rowan listened without interrupting, without offering solutions before the picture was complete. Tess sat beside her mother with the account book on her lap, following the account with her eyes, and occasionally making small notations in the margin that Mara noticed but didn't comment on. When Mara was done, Ada sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a full 30 seconds. Then she said, "I know 4 more families." Mara felt her stomach turn over. 4 more. 3 of them lost land in the past 2 years. One is a same situation as you notice came in October auction sometime in the spring. Ada brought her gaze back down from the ceiling. "I've been talking to them, separately. They were all too scared to do anything about it, because they thought they were alone." "They're not alone," Mara said. "No," Ada said. "They're not. Not anymore." She looked at Mara steadily. "This lawyer of yours. This Mercer, how good is he?" "I don't know him personally." "Rowan trusts him." "And do you trust Rowan?" It was a direct question, which was the only kind Ada asked. Mara thought about it honestly. "I trust him enough," she said. "Kept my eyes open, and I've asked hard questions, and I haven't caught him in anything." She paused. "He went out in the snow with a wound in his side to get medicine for Lottie. He didn't have to do that. He knew I'd have found another way. But he did it anyway." "He did it anyway," Ada nodded slowly. "All right, I'll get the 4 families. You tell me when the lawyer arrives, and I'll have them ready." The drive back from Ada's was quiet for a while, the buckboard moving slow through the packed snow. On the track, the horse being careful and sensible about the footing. The sky was the particular flat white of a day that was conserving itself for something. "Mom," Tess said. Can I see the account book? The one with the taxes and the loan figures." Mara looked at her sideways. "Why?" "Because I've been looking at the numbers you have in the back, and I think there might be something wrong with how the loan payment is being calculated. The interest compound." Tess says it carefully, like she'd been rehearsing the phrasing. "Clause in the extension that you said you didn't understand when you signed it. I want to look at it." Mara held the reins for a moment, the horse breathing steady clouds into the cold air. "You've been doing the math on it," she said. "For about 2 weeks," Tess admitted. Mara thought about telling her that she shouldn't have been worrying about it. About say its windows were dark. She's saying it was too complicated, or that she should let the adults handle it. And she recognized both impulses as the kind of well-intentioned foolishness that would take something real from her daughter and give her nothing back. "When we get home," she said instead, "I'll get out the loan documents." Tess looked straight ahead at the road, but Mara saw the small, precise movement of her shoulders settling. "Thank you," Tess said. The problem that nobody talked about during those 9 days was also the simplest and most immediate one. They were running out of food. Not catastrophically, not yet, but close enough that Mara had started doing the pantry math twice a day instead of once, which was never a good sign. The preserved tomatoes were down to 1 jar. The flour was at the level where you started thinking carefully about each use. Cornmeal was low. Cal was eating well because she made sure of it, and Lottie was recovering and had her appetite back, which was good and also put more demand on what was there, and Tess had started the quiet meal skipping again, and Mara had caught it this time and said flatly, "Stop it. Eat your dinner," and Tess had looked at her and said, "There isn't enough," and Mara had said, "There's enough for tonight. That's what matters." Eat, and Tess had eaten, but the look on her face had been the look of someone who was only partially convinced. Mara had 18, which was still 18. She'd been very careful with it, which meant she hadn't touched it, which meant it was still exactly 18, and would continue to be 18 until she spent it, at which point it would be less, and less was a problem. On the 6th day after Rowan left, she took the 18 to the Halverson General Store in town, which was the direction she'd been trying not to go because spending it meant it was gone. She bought flour and cornmeal and a small piece of salt pork and a jar of molasses and 4 pounds of dried beans. She came home with 3.22 remaining, which felt exactly like what it was. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and looked at the 3.22 and the account book and the loan documents that Tess had gone through with the careful, merciless attention of a 12-year-old who is very good at math and too old to pretend otherwise. Tess had been right about the compound interest clause. The calculation in the extension document wasn't being run correctly, or rather, it was being run in a way that was technically within the letter of the contract, but was structured to maximize what the borrower owed rather than what a fair reading of the rate would produce. It was the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. It was the kind of thing that somebody with Mercer's experience might be able to do something about. Mara wrote it all down on a separate page and put it in the account book. She was still sitting there when she heard the wind pick up outside and remembered that she hadn't brought in the last of the kindling from the lean-to, and she wrapped herself in her coat and went out to get it. And that was when she realized that the brown cow was making a sound she'd never made before, a low, distant sound that carried clearly in the cold. And she went to the barn instead and found the animal standing in her stall with her head down and her breathing wrong. She was up the rest of that night with the cow, and she kept the cow alive by a combination of stubbornness and the things she'd learned watching Daniel work cattle, and one moment around 4 a.m, where she sat in the straw with her back against the stall wall and her knees pulled up. Most of its windows were dark, and felt the exhaustion so completely that it moved through her and came out the other side into something that was almost peace. Cow made it through. By morning she was standing better, eating a little, and the sound she was making had returned to something recognizable. Cal appeared in the barn at 6, took one look at the cow, and then at his mother's face, and said, "You were here all night." Yes, he considered this. Then he went of its windows were darmy biscuit from the kitchen and brought it back to her and stood there while she ate it, which was the closest thing to being taken care of that she'd felt in quite a while, and it came from an 8-year-old boy, and she was grateful enough for it that her eyes stung, which she didn't let him see. On the 10th day, she started to worry about Rowan. She didn't admit this to anyone, not even herself in any direct way. She just noticed that she was looking out the front window more frequently than usual, and that, when Cal asked at dinner if they'd heard anything, she answered too quickly, which Tess noticed and didn't comment on, which somehow made it worse. On the 11th day, she told herself she'd been foolish. On the 12th day, she had a specific, unpleasant thought about what it meant to trust a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks with a plan that was her last real option, and she held that thought and examined it from several angles. And none of the angles were comfortable. On the 13th day, Rourke's man came. He wasn't Rourke himself. Mara would almost have preferred that, because Rourke at least showed you his face. The man he sent was a large, flat-featured individual named Cutler, whom she recognized from the courthouse, where he stood behind Rourke at public meetings with his arms crossed and an expression suggesting he was professionally unimpressed by everything he saw. He rode into the yard on a gray horse and tied up at the gate without being invited and came to the door and knocked like it was his door to knock on. Mara opened it without the poker this time because she decided that keeping the poker out of sight was the better strategy when she wanted to project calm. Mrs. Vance, Cutler said. He had a flat, carrying voice. "The judge wanted me to remind you about the auction date. December 23rd. Said he hadn't heard from you regarding any appeal and wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings." "No misunderstandings," Mara said pleasantly. Cutler looked past her into the house with a specificity that was not accidental. "Judge also wanted me to let you know that he's sympathetic to your situation. As a widow. He says if you'd like to discuss a voluntary transfer of the property prior to the auction to avoid any unpleasantness, he'd be open to that conversation." Mara held the door frame with one hand. She kept her face entirely neutral, which required more effort than she showed. "Voluntary transfer," she repeated. "At a fair price," Cutler said, in the tone of a man who had delivered this line before and knew it wasn't quite as believable as it needed to be. "He understands it's a difficult position. Tell the judge I appreciate his concern," Mara said, "and that I'll see him at the courthouse on the 23rd. Cutler looked at her. He was trying to read something in her face. She could see him doing it. And she was pleased that he apparently couldn't. "That's your answer," he said. "That's my answer," he wrote out. She watched him go from the doorway, and she kept her expression steady until he'd cleared the gate and turned north on the road. And then she went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Tess was standing in the doorway to the back room. Cal behind her, smaller, watching. "Who was that?" Cal said. "A man with a message," Mara said. "Nothing to worry about." "What was the message?" She looked at her son. His jaw was set in that adult way he had, that way that didn't belong on an 8-year-old's face, but was there anyway, and she'd stopped trying to argue with it. The message, she said carefully, was that the people trying to take this place away from us are getting nervous. And nervous means we're doing something right. Cal thought about this. Then he turned and went back into the back room. A moment later, she heard the hammer being set down on the floor, and she realized he'd been holding it the whole time. Cutler was there, and she hadn't noticed. She went to the window and looked out at the empty yard. December 20th, 3 days. No Rowan, no lawyer, no word. She went to the barn and picked up the splitting maul, split enough wood for 4 days, and did not think about what she would do if he didn't come back, because thinking about it would not help. And there were always things that needed doing, and she had never yet run out of things that needed doing. That evening she wrote out the full plan again, from the beginning, everything she knew about Rourke's scheme, everything Ada had gathered, Tess's analysis of the loan document, the names of the 3 shell companies and the registered agent and his relationship to Rourke, and she clearly as she could. Because if Rowan came back with Mercer, there would not be time to organize it then. And if Rowan didn't come back, she needed to know exactly what she had and what she could do with it on her own. She had more than she'd thought, actually. Setting it out in order like that, she could see it. It wasn't nothing. It was not nothing at all. She was still sitting at the table at 10 o'clock that night when she heard the horses. Not one horse. Multiple horses, moving along the road, and the sound was coming from the south, which was the direction of town, which was not the direction she'd been watching, but should have been, because Denver was south. She went to the door. 2 horses and a buckboard behind them. Rowan was on the near horse, and he looked like a man who had been riding hard for 2 days, which he probably had. On the buckboard, wrapped in a heavy coat, and looking somewhat startled by the darkness and the cold and the remoteness of the location he'd apparently agreed to travel to, was a man she didn't know, compact, middle-aged, wire glasses that had fogged from the cold, a case of documents strapped to the buckboard seats beside him with the particular care you give to things that matter. Rowan pulled up at the gate and looked at her standing in the doorway. "I told you I'd be back before the 23rd, he said. "It's the 20th, she said. "I know. I'm 3 days early." She looked at the man on the buckboard, who had pushed his glasses up and was looking at the homestead with an expression that might have been assessing and might have been simply exhausted. "Gideon Mercer," Rowan said. "The lawyer." Mercer looked at her. He had quick, intelligent eyes behind the fogged glasses, and he seemed to be taking in the house and the yard and Mara herself with the same detailed attention. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I've been told you have documentation on a potentially significant pattern of fraudulent land transactions in this county." "I have documentation," Mara said. "Whether it's significant is what I need you to tell me. That's a reasonable position." He climbed down from the buckboard with the stiffness of a man who had been sitting for many hours and was paying for it. "I'll need to see everything you have. Tonight, if possible. We don't have a great deal of time." "I've got everything organized," Mara said. "Come in." She stepped back from the doorway, and they came in out of the cold, and the door closed behind them, and the fire was going, and the lamp was lit, and the account book and the organized pages were on the table. And 3 days was not much time at all, but it was the time they had, and Mara Vance had never yet wasted the time she had. Rowan caught her eye as he came through the door just for a second. She gave him a single small nod. He nodded back. Then they sat down at the table, all 3 of them, and they got to work. Mercer worked through the night, not figuratively, literally through the night, sitting at Mara's kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and his glasses pushed up on his forehead more often than not, because he read better without them at close range, and he was reading everything. Every page Mara had organized, every note Tess had made in the margins, Ada's letter, the loan documents, the original assessment notice with Rourke's seal, the names of the 3 shell companies and the registered agent, and the chain of land transfers Ada's contact at the registry office had pulled. He read it all, made his own notes in a handwriting so small and compressed that it looked like code, occasionally asked a question. Without looking up from the page, Mara answered every question. Rowan sat at the far end of the table and drank coffee and mostly stayed quiet, which she'd noticed was something he was genuinely good at, being present without taking up more space than he needed to. Around midnight, Tess appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose, eyes not even slightly sleepy. Go back to bed, Mara said. I heard him ask about the loan compound clause, Tess said, addressing this to Mercer rather than her mother. I did the recalculation. Do you want to see it? Mercer looked up for the first time in an hour. He looked at the 12-year-old standing in the doorway, then at Mara, then back at Tess. Yes, he said simply. Sit down. Mara started to object, and then stopped herself, because she'd made herself a promise about this in the buckboard on the way back from Ada's, and she kept her promises. Tess sat down. She took the account book and opened it to the page with her calculations and slid it across the table to Mercer. He studied it. He didn't say anything for a while. Tess sat straight-backed and waited, which was a kind of patience Mar recognized as something the girl had developed on her own, without being taught. This is correct, Mercer said finally. I know, Tess said. Something shifted at the corner of Mercer's mouth. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. He looked at Mara. The interest calculation in the extension is being compounded on a schedule that's technically consistent with the contract language, but represents a significant departure from what a standard reading of the rate would produce. He tapped the page. This is not an accident. Someone drafted this clause specifically to function this way. Can we challenge it? Mara asked. We can do more than challenge it. If the bank is applying the same clause structure to multiple loans, and I'd be very surprised if they're not, we're looking at a pattern of predatory lending that a territorial court would take seriously, particularly in the context of everything else. He looked back at Ada's letter. The shell companies, the registered agent, the auction prices misses. Vance, I have to be direct with you. What you have here is not just a case for one property. What you have is the outline of a criminal conspiracy. The kitchen was very quiet. Say that again, Rowan said from the end of the table. Mercer looked at him. Rourke isn't running a legal scheme that's merely exploitative. The combination of inflated assessments, manipulated auctions, and a banking instrument specifically structured to accelerate default taken together with a common beneficiary across all transactions, this is coordinated fraud. Crosses from civil into criminal territory. He folded his hands on the table. The question is whether we have enough to get a territorial court to freeze the auctions pending investigation. That is a high bar, and we have 3 days. Do we have enough? Mara asked. Mercer was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than she wanted it to. We have enough to try, he said. Tess went back to bed at 12:30, which she did under protest, and only because Mercer told her, straightforwardly, that he needed her sharp in the morning and sleep was not optional. She accepted this from him in a way she might not have from her mother, which Mara noted without resentment because she understood it. Tess had made a decision about Mercer in the last hour, had assessed him and found him worth listening to, and that was its own kind of useful. Rowan found Mara standing on the porch at 1 a.m. She'd gone out for air. The kitchen had gotten close with the lamp, and 3 people's breath and the specific heat of a problem being worked on intensively. Cold outside was sharp and clean, and the sky was clear for the first time. In days, the stars very bright and dense above the ridge. She heard him behind her and didn't turn. He thinks we can do it, she said. He said we have enough to try. With Mercer, those are the same thing. Rowan came to stand beside her at the porch rail. He doesn't overstate. If he said we had nothing, he'd have told us tonight and saved everyone the trip. Mara looked out at the yard. The snow was blue-white under the stars, the fence posts casting thin shadows, the barn dark and solid. 160 acres. Daniel's irrigation channel running under 3 feet of frozen ground somewhere to the east. Water rights that Rourke wanted badly enough to run a 13-year scheme to get them. Cal stopped sleeping with the hammer, she said. I know. I noticed when I came in. He started doing it after Daniel died. I think he decided someone had to be in charge of being afraid on behalf of everyone else. She paused. That's too much for an 8-year-old. Yes, Rowan said, not trying to fix it, just agreeing with her. I've been carrying it too, she said, not with a hammer, just carrying it. She turned the collar of her coat up against the cold. Keep thinking I should be angrier at you. For the watch, for not telling me, for wandering around with $12,000 while people like the Hendersons and the Garrittys lost everything they built. You should be angry at me for that, Rowan said. That's fair. I am angry at you for it. She looked sideways at him. I'm also aware that you went and got a lawyer and came back. So I'm holding both things at once. Comfortable. I imagine it is. Don't be agreeable about everything. It's irritating. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight she could see the line of his jaw and the tiredness in his face from 2 days of hard riding. And she could also see the thing that had been there underneath everything since the beginning. That particular, careful attention he paid to her, not the attention of a man calculating. The attention of a man who was trying to understand something he thought mattered. I'll try to be more argumentative, he said. She almost laughed. She caught it just before it got out, pressed her lips together. Go back inside. You need sleep more than I do. Do I? You've been on a horse for 2 days. I've been sitting at a kitchen table. Yes. He went back inside without arguing further, which she decided to count as him taking her advice, and she stayed on the porch for another 10 minutes watching the stars and letting the cold work on the tangled knot in her chest until some of it loosened. She went in and slept for 4 hours, which was enough. The next 2 days were a kind of controlled chaos that Mara would look back on later as one of the most exhausting and oddly invigorating things she'd ever lived through, which was saying something given the competition. Mercer needed witnesses, not just Ada's documentation, not just the paper trail. He needed the families themselves, in person, willing to make formal statements about what had happened to them. Each statement needed to be consistent, specific, and connected to the documentary evidence. It was not a simple thing to ask of people who had already been beaten down by the system once and had reason to believe that going up against Rourke again would only make things worse for them. This was where Ada Crowley became indispensable. She arrived at Blackthorn Crossing on the morning of December 21st, with 4 families in tow, or near enough the Jessup family from the North Valley, 2 brothers named Fowler, who had lost their joint claim the previous spring, a woman named Petra Sands, who had been fighting her assessment alone since August, and old Martin Heck, who was 68 and had lost the claim his wife had filed in her own name before she died, and who had a particular quality of dignified, patient fury that Mercer recognized immediately as the most useful thing in the room. They came in wagons and on horseback, arriving over the course of 2 hours, and Mara's small house became considerably smaller as people filled it, and Cal and Lottie were sent to the barn with the instruction to check on the brown cow, and also to stay there for a while, which Cal understood and accepted, and took his sister to go do without complaint. Tess stayed. Mara didn't send her away. Tess sat in the corner with the account book and wrote down everything, and Mercer glanced at her once and then didn't look surprised again, which meant he'd already adjusted his understanding of who was in this room. Ada made the introductions. She did it the way she did everything, with economy and precision, no warmth wasted on performance. This is Gideon Mercer. He's a lawyer from Denver. He's here because Mara Vance asked him to be. And Mara Vance is the reason any of us has a chance at getting what was taken from us back. Listen to him. Answer his questions straight. Don't tell him what you think he wants to hear. Tell him what actually happened. Then she sat down and folded her hands and looked at Mercer expectantly. Mercer stood up. He was not a large man, and he was not a dramatic man, and the way he began was almost conversational, which Mara suspected was deliberate. These were people who had been battered by officialdom and process, and starting with the weight of legal formality would have put walls up before anything useful could happen. I want to understand what happened to each of you, he said, not in legal language, just what happened, and when, and what you saw and received in writing. We'll start from the beginning. They talked for 6 hours. Mara listened to all of it. She'd known abstractly that other families had lost land, had heard pieces of various stories from Ada and through the valley's slow-moving information system, but hearing it directly, in the voices of the people it had happened to, was different. The Jessup family had received their inflated assessment 11 months ago. They'd tried to appeal it, same as Mara, same clerk, same bench, same 40-minute wait, same pleasant explanation of the appeal process timeline. Most of its windows were dark. The auction of their property had been moved forward by 3 weeks without notice, which meant by the time they received the new date in writing, the property had already been sold to Northern Slope Properties for $53. The Fowler brothers had fought harder. They'd hired a local lawyer, the only one in town, a man named Pritchard, who had an office above the feed store and whose relationship with Rourke, Mercer's expression suggested he was filing away for later inquiry, was apparently close enough to be worth examining. Most of its windows were dark. Pritchard had advised them that their case was weak, that the assessment was within legal parameters, and that contesting the auction would cost more than the land was worth. They'd listened to him. They'd lost the claim. 6 months later, they'd seen the property advertised for sale by a company called Northern Slope Properties for $420. The same company that had bought it from the county for $53. Petra Sands had a different story, which was that she hadn't lost her land yet, but was going to, and she knew it, and she'd spent 4 months trying to figure out how to stop it and had run into the same walls at every turn. She was 34, a small woman, with a precise clipped way of speaking that suggested she'd been managing her anger about this situation carefully for a long time and was very tired of managing it. Martin Heck didn't say much. When Mercer asked him to describe what had happened, he said, "My wife filed that claim in 1879. Her name was on the deed. She died in 84, and the land came to me, and I kept it right, paid my taxes every year, never missed a payment, and then in the spring of last year my assessment went up enough that I couldn't make the full amount, and by August they'd taken it." He stopped. He looked at his hands. Her name was Clara. She'd have been 61 years old this December. Nobody said anything for a moment. Mercer nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Heck," he said. And the way he said it was not a formality. Then he went back to Pat's papers. By the time they were done, Mercer had 18 formal witnesses because Ada's connections had apparently extended further than the 4 families in the room, and she'd arrived with additional written accounts from people who couldn't be there in person, accounts she'd been quietly collecting for months with the patient thoroughness of a woman who had long suspected this day would come even if she hadn't known exactly when. 18 families, 18 sets of inflated assessments, 18 auctions. 18 properties sold to shell companies controlled by Rourke's brother-in-law at prices so far below market value that the pattern was not subtle. It was simply that no one had ever put all 18 cases in the same room before. Mercer sat back after the last statement was recorded and looked at the assembled papers and said, "This is enough." Ada, who had been sitting with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral for 6 hours, allowed herself a small, precise nod. "Good," she said. "I need to send a rider to the territorial capital tonight," Mercer said. "I have a contact with the territorial prosecutor's office. I'm going to send him everything, the full evidentiary package, and request an emergency freeze on all auctions in this county pending investigation. That request has to be in his hands before December 23rd. "Who rides?" Rowan asked. "Someone who can cover 50 miles in 2 days in January," Mercer said. "I'll go," said one of the Fowler brothers, the younger one, whose name was Pete. Most of its windows were dark, and who had the build and the stubborn energy of someone who needed to do something physical with his anger. "I know that road. I can make it." "You'll need fresh horses at the Calhoun relay station in Millhaven," Rowan said. "I'll cover the cost." Pete Fowler looked at Rowan for a moment with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite suspicion, but was honestly somewhere between them, which was probably fair. He'd heard the windows were dark, of who Rowan was from Ada, who had given him the unembellished version, and he was still working out what to do with it. "All right," Pete said finally. Mercer wrote the writer's letter himself, there at Mara's kitchen table, drafting and revising with a speed that suggested he'd written documents under pressure before. Took him 40 minutes. He read it over once, made 2 small changes, folded it, sealed it, and handed it to Pete Fowler. "Don't lose it," he said. "I won't," Pete said, in the tone of a man who found the instruction slightly insulting, which was probably the right tone. Pete Fowler rode out at 6 in the evening into the cold dark, and Mara watched him go from the gate. She felt dews were dark, and she felt the particular weightlessness that comes when you have done everything you can do, and the outcome has left your hands and is traveling away from you into the dark. The morning of December 22nd, with fresh snow and the information, delivered by a neighbor's boy passing through on his way to town, that Rourke had moved the auction start time up by 2 hours, from 10 in the morning to 8, no posted notice. The change had apparently been communicated to interested parties, meaning Rourke's foreman, and the men connected to the shell companies, but not to the general public. Marcia received this information over breakfast and set down her coffee cup and looked at Mercer. "He knows something," she said. Mercer's expression didn't change. "Possibly. Or he's being cautious out of habit." He paused. "Either way, it means we need to be at the courthouse before 8. We'll be there at 7, Mara said. What happened in the remainder of that day and into the evening was preparation of a different kind than the previous day's work, not legal preparation, but human preparation, the business of reaching people in time and making sure they understood what was happening and what they needed to do. Rowan and Ada between them rode to 6 separate homesteads to make sure the families who'd given statements knew the time had changed and were still willing to come. Most of them didn't have lawyers. Most of them didn't fully understand what a territorial freeze request meant or what the morning might look like. What they understood was that someone was finally asking them to stand up and be counted, and that there were other people standing up too, and that 18 families together were a different thing than 18 families alone. Mara stayed at the house. She had things to settle there before she could go anywhere. She sat Cal and Lottie and Tess down at the kitchen table after dinner and told them what was happening. Not a simplified version, not a reassuring version, the actual version, as clearly and completely as was appropriate for each of them. Lottie was 5 and got a shorter version that emphasized the word fair and the idea that the people trying to take their house were being stopped. Cal got the medium version, including the auction and the lawyer and the witnesses, and he listened with his hands flat on the table and his face very serious. Tess got the full version, because Tess had earned it, and they both knew it. When Mara was done, Lottie said, "Are we going to keep our house?" "Yes," Mara said. "That's what tomorrow is about." Lottie accepted this with the completeness that only small children can manage, that total shift from concern to relief, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before. Cal looked at Mara. "Can I come?" he said. "No, I could." "No, Cal." She said it firmly but not sharply because she understood the impulse, and she wasn't going to shame him for it. "I need you here. Tess is coming with me, because she's been part of building this from the beginning, and I'm not going to take that away from her. But I need you here with Lottie, and I need to know that you're here, and that is not a small thing. That's the thing I need most." He worked this over in his mind with that 8-year-old seriousness that she was starting to understand was just who he was, not a phase, not a symptom of anything, just Cal, the way Tess was Tess. "Okay," he said, "but you have to tell me everything when you get back." "Every single thing," Mara promised. She went to bed at 10 and lay awake until midnight, which was better than she'd expected. At midnight, she made herself close her eyes and stay still, and at some point she slept, because she woke up to the sound of Rowan moving in the front room at 5 in the morning, adding wood to the stove, and she lay there for a moment in the dark, listening to the ordinary sound of it. She got up and got dressed and went out. He already had the coffee on. He looked up when she came in, and he looked like a man who also hadn't slept as much as he should have, which she found obscurely comforting in the way that shared sleeplessness can be comforting. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." "Couldn't sleep." "Me neither." She got 2 cups down from the shelf. "Is Mercer awake?" He never stopped. Rowan tilted his head toward the table, where Mercer's lamp was still lit, though the man himself had apparently stepped outside for a moment. He's been reviewing the documents again, making sure everything is in order. "If Pete got through," Mara said. "He got through." Rowan said it with a confidence she wasn't sure he had any particular basis for, but she appreciated it anyway. He's reliable. His family had a freight route through the mountains for 10 years. He knows how to move in winter. Mercer came back in, stamping snow off his boots, his glasses immediately fogging. He took them off and cleaned them and put them back on and looked at both of them with the alert, slightly gaunt expression of a man operating on about 3 hours of sleep and a great deal of professional focus. "Are we ready?" Mara asked him. "Legally, yes," Mercer said. "The evidentiary package is solid. If the freeze request reached the territorial office in time, we'll have a procedural shield that Rourke cannot ignore without violating a direct court order." A pause. "If it didn't reach in time, or if the territorial prosecutor decides not to act on it, we still have the witnesses. We still have the documentation. We present everything publicly in front of whoever is in that courthouse, and we make it impossible for Rourke to proceed without the whole county knowing exactly what he's been doing. And if he proceeds anyway, Mara said. Mercer looked at her steadily. Then we fight the next round. But I don't think it comes to that. He said it with the same calibrated confidence Rowan had used, and coming from Mercer, it had a different weight, not reassurance, but professional assessment. He's not going to want this in the open. Everything he's built depends on each transaction being separate, isolated, unconnected to the others. The moment we put 18 families in the same room and read the same registered agent's name aloud in public, that structure collapses. He knows that, which is why he moved the time. He's trying to get it done before we can stop him, Tess said. She was standing in the doorway, fully dressed, her hair braided, and the account book under her arm. She had apparently been listening for some time. Mercer looked at her. Essentially, yes. Then we should go, Tess said. It was 20 miles to town. They left at 6 in the pre-dawn dark, Mara and Tess and Rowan and Mercer in the buckboard, the horse moving steadily through snow that had packed enough overnight to make the road passable. It was very cold. Nobody talked much for the first few miles, which was appropriate. There was nothing left to plan. What was left was just the doing of it. They reached the outskirts of town a little after 7 and found, to Mara's considerable relief, that they were not alone. Ada was already there, her wagon tied up near the livery, and standing with her in the gray morning light were people, more people than Mara had expected, clustered in groups of 2 and 3 in front of the courthouse steps, breath steaming, faces tight against the cold, and something else, something harder and more deliberate. She recognized the Jessup family. The Fowler brothers, both of them, which meant Pete had made it back, which meant the letter had been sent, which was the first solid piece of good news she'd had since the previous morning. Petra Sands, old Martin Heck standing very straight, hands in his coat pockets. Faces she half recognized from the valley. People she'd seen at the general store or at the crossroads. People who had heard from someone who'd heard from someone that something was happening at the courthouse this morning that was worth seeing. There were more of them than she'd known to expect. Rowan pulled the buckboard to a stop, and Mara climbed down, and Ada walked to meet her with the direct, ceremony stride she used for everything. How many? Mara asked. Counting everyone? 26. Mara stopped. I made some additional inquiries, Ada said without apology. There were people I hadn't reached before. When I explained what we were doing, they came. 26 people, standing in the cold at 7 in the morning to do something that might not work, because someone had finally asked them to stand somewhere together instead of alone. Mara looked at the courthouse. The doors were still closed. Somewhere inside, she knew, Rourke was either already there or arriving soon, and his foreman was probably already there, and the men connected to the shell companies, and the auctioneer who'd presided over 18 transactions in 2 years without apparently finding anything unusual about any of them. Tess appeared at her elbow. Mom Mara looked at her. We did this, Tess said. It was not triumphant. It was just accurate. We did, Mara said. At 7:40, a rider arrived from the North Road and tied up at speeds outside the courthouse and went inside with a document case. Mercer saw it happen and went very still for a moment, and then turned to Mara's with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who is not given to shows of relief, but is experiencing it anyway. That's a territorial court courier, he said. Mara looked at the courthouse doors. The freeze came through, Mercer said quietly. At 8 o'clock exactly, the courthouse doors opened. Rourke came out first. He was a tall man, well-dressed, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for so long that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. He stopped on the top step and looked out at the crowd assembled in front of him. His face did something complicated and controlled. He recognized Mara, he recognized Ada. He looked at Mercer, whom he didn't know, and at the faces of the families arrayed behind them, faces he perhaps did recognize, families he had processed through his auction system, one at a time over 2 years, and he looked at them standing together now, and something behind his eyes recalculated. He didn't show it for long. He smoothed it over with the practiced facility of a man who'd been managing appearances for 20 years. He descended 2 steps. Mrs. Vance, he said pleasantly. I see you've assembled quite a group, I have, Mara said. The auction is scheduled to begin in a few minutes. If you have a legitimate legal challenge to file, the clerk's office. Mr. Rourke. Mercer stepped forward. He produced a document from his coat and held it up. My name is Gideon Mercer. I represent Mrs. Vance and the 18 additional landowners who have filed formal complaints with the territorial court regarding a pattern of fraudulent land assessment and auction manipulation in this county. This is a freeze order issued by the territorial court at 6:15 this morning, suspending all property auctions in Holt County pending investigation of those complaints. He held the document toward Rourke. The auction will not proceed today. The silence on the courthouse steps was absolute for about 3 seconds. Then Rourke's foreman's Cutler, the flat-featured man who had come to Mara's door, moved forward from somewhere to Rourke's left, and Rourke put one hand out very slightly, and Cutler stopped. Rourke looked at the document. He didn't take it. A territorial freeze order, he said, with the air of a man examining something mildly interesting. On what grounds? Coordinated fraud, Mercer said. Specifically, the systematic inflation of property assessments to manufacture default conditions, followed by staged auctions, at which the only competitive bidder was a set of shell companies controlled by your brother-in-law Ellis Croft. He paused. We have 18 witness statements, all documented assessments, the auction records, the land transfer documents, and the registration papers for Crescent Land Holdings, Northern Slope Properties, and Clearwater Land Trust. Another pause. Investigators from the Territorial Prosecutor's Office are currently on their way to Holt County. They should arrive before nightfall. Rourke's face had not moved. He was very good at that, at keeping his face from moving. Mara watched him, and she could see it anyway, the thing happening behind his eyes, that rapid, invisible recalculation, the assessment of options, the sudden geography of a man who has discovered that the ground he's standing on is not what he thought it was. He looked past Mercer. He looked at the assembled families, at the 26 people standing in the cold with their visible breath, and their various expressions, not rage, mostly, not performance, just the specific and implacable presence of people who had been wronged and had come to say so in a place where it would be recorded. He looked at Ada, who looked back at him with 71 years of unimpressed patience. He looked at Martin Heck, standing very straight, with his hands in his coat pockets and his face doing nothing at all. He looked at Mara. She met his eyes. For a moment, the two of them just looked at each other, and in that moment all the pleasantness drained completely out of his face, and she saw what was under it, which was not impressive or frightening, it was just small. A man who had built a large structure out of smallness, and the structure was coming down. He took the document. He read it. He handed it back to Mercer. The auction is suspended, he said, and then he turned and went back inside, and the doors closed behind him. The sound that went through the assembled crowd was not a cheer. It was quieter than that, a collective release of breath. The particular sound of people who have been holding something tightly for a very long time and have just been permitted to let it go. It was better than a cheer. It was the sound of relief that knows it's real. Pete Fowler made a noise that was partly laugh and partly something else. The older Fowler brother put his hand briefly on the back of Pete's neck. Petra Sands stood very still with her eyes closed. Martin Heck looked at the courthouse doors for a long moment and then looked away, and his face said what his voice probably couldn't have. Ada came to stand beside Mara while Ada said, "Well," Mara agreed. Tess had pushed forward to Mara's side at some point during the confrontation, and she was standing there now with the account book held against her chest and her face showing something that Mara recognized as the expression of a person who has accomplished something real and is figuring out how to hold it without it getting out of her hands. Rowan was behind and to her left. She turned to look at him. He looked like someone who was very tired and not trying to be anything right now, which she appreciated more than she could easily say. "The investigators still have to come," she said. "This isn't finished." "No," he said. "But it started right." Mercer appeared at her elbow, putting papers back in his document case with the methodical care of a man whose work is not done, but whose most urgent part is. The freeze holds pending investigation. Given the volume and consistency of the evidence, I expect the territorial prosecutor to move formally within 2 weeks. The shell company holdings will be examined. The bank loan structure will be part of the investigation. He glanced at her. Your deed is not going anywhere. Mara looked at the courthouse. Closed doors. At the empty steps where Rourke had stood. For years, he had survived because every family he'd taken from had fought alone, in their own private desperation, unable to see that the shape of their problem was the same shape as everyone else's. That was the architecture of what he'd built, not just the fraud, but the isolation. The way each assessment arrived, separately, each auction was conducted separately, each family was left to conclude that their situation was unique and their defeat was personal. It wasn't personal. It had never been personal. That was, in a strange way, both the worst and the most useful thing about it. She became aware that people were moving around her, small conversations starting up, the ordinary sounds of a crowd beginning to disperse, and she stood in the middle of it and felt the December cold in her face and her hands, and thought about the wood she'd split and the soup she'd given away, and the envelope with 3.22 in it, sitting in the kitchen at Blackthorn Crossing, and the cow that had almost died, and Lottie's fever, and Cal with the hammer, and Tess with the account book and the 8 steps across her kitchen floor. 160 acres. Daniel's channel running under the frozen ground. Still hers. Rowan put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Just that. Just for a moment, and then it was gone. No speech, no summation. Just that. She pulled her coat tighter and turned to face her daughter and her lawyer and the 26 people who had come out in the cold, and the morning held everything that had brought them here, and the afternoon was just beginning. The investigators arrived before nightfall, as Mercer had said they would. 2 of them, from the territorial prosecutor's office, in the capital a lean, methodical man named Aldous Crane, who wore a dark coat and had the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had been building cases for a long time and understood that speed and thoroughness were not the same thing, and a younger man named Webb, who carried a second document case and said very little but wrote everything down. They came into town on the afternoon stage, checked into the hotel on Main Street, and by 6 in the evening were seated in the back room of the hotel with Mercer, working through the evidentiary package with the focused attention of men who had read the letter Pete Fowler had carried and understood what they were looking at. Mara was not in that room. She and Tess had driven back to Blackthorn Crossing in the late afternoon because Cal was alone with Lottie, and she'd made herself a promise about not leaving them overnight, and because there was nothing further she could do at the courthouse that Mercer couldn't handle better without her in the way. This was a thing she teach herself over the previous weeks, when to push forward and when to step back and let the right person do the right work. It did not come naturally to her. She was still learning it. The drive home was quiet in a way that was different from the drive out. The morning silence had been the silence of Pulpul holding something tightly. This was looser, not relaxed exactly. Too much was still unresolved for relaxed, but the particular quality of quiet that follows a moment when something real has happened and you're still in the process of understanding what it means. Tess had the account book on her lap, which was where it seemed to live now, and she was looking out at the snow going blue-gray in the failing light. "Do you think he'll go to prison?" she asked. Mara considered the question honestly. "I don't know. Mercer thinks the evidence is strong. But courts take time, and powerful men have resources, and sometimes things don't end the way they should." She paused. "What I know is that he won't keep doing what he's been doing. That part is finished. Is that enough? For the families who lost land and might get it back, or get compensated, yes. For the ones who lost more than land." She thought of Martin Heck, of the way he'd said his wife's name. "That's a different question, and it doesn't have a clean answer." Tess was quiet for a moment. "I used to think things ended," she said. "Like finished. Done. But they don't really, do they? They just change what they are." Mara looked at her daughter sideways. 12 years old, sitting in the cold with her father's old account book on her lap, having just spent a week doing work that most adults in the territory wouldn't have known how to do. "No," Mara said. "They don't. They came home to find Cal had made an attempt at dinner." This was a development that revealed itself through the smell of something mildly scorched coming through the door, and through Cal standing at the stove with a defensive expression that said he knew exactly what he'd done to the cornmeal and had decided to be upfront about it rather than hope nobody noticed. "I tried to make the mush," he said. "It stuck." Mara looked at the pot. The bottom quarter of it was going to require significant attention. It's all right, she said. I thought you'd be later. We came back when we said we would. She took the pot from the stove and set it aside and looked at him. Are you okay? Yes. He said it quickly, then reconsidered. I didn't like being left here, I know, I'm sorry. He looked at her, checking whether she meant it, which she did, and apparently he could tell because he nodded once and let it go. Lottie's asleep already. She ate good. Good. Mara ruffled his hair, which he tolerated in the way he tolerated most things, with the patience of someone who had decided that some indignities were acceptable from their mother. You did well. He stood straighter, almost imperceptibly. She salvaged what she could of the cornmeal, added some salt pork she'd been saving, and made it into something that was not beautiful but was hot and filling, and they ate it together at the kitchen table, the three of them, with the fire doing its work and the cold pressing at the windows and the lamp throwing its yellow circle across the table, and their hands. Rowan came back the following morning. He'd stayed in town for the initial meeting with Crane and Webb and arrived at Blackthorn Crossing at 8 with Mercer behind him, and the news that the investigators had spent the night going through the land registry documents and had already identified 7 additional transactions beyond the 18 they'd started with. 7 more families, 7 more properties at impossible auction prices, all moving through the same rotating cast of shell companies. 25 families in total, 2 years of work. Mara sat at the table and listened to this and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. 25 families. She thought about how many of those families had sat somewhere the way she'd sat on that bench in Rourke's courthouse waiting room, the 40-minute wait, the pleasant explanation, the unreadable face, and had come away believing that they were alone, that what had happened to them was somehow their own failure to understand a system that had in fact been specifically designed to defeat them. What happens to the land they already sold? She asked Mercer. Mercer sat down across from her. He had slept. This morning, she could see it, the difference from the gaunt alertness of the previous 2 days. He looked like a man who had done his most urgent work and was now in the somewhat less frantic phase of everything that followed. The transfers will be under review. Where properties were sold through Croft's companies and then resold to third parties, it gets complicated. Bona fide purchasers have some legal protection and will have to work through each case individually. But where the land is still held by the shell companies, which Crane believes is the majority of cases, those holdings can be challenged directly. And the bank loans? The compound clause issue is separate from the fraud case, but it's going to the same court. If the clause was used consistently across multiple loans, and my expectation is that it was the bank's entire loan portfolio in this county is going to be examined. He looked at her steadily. Your specific obligation, once the fraudulent assessment is set aside, and the loan clause is corrected, is significantly lower than what you've been told you owe. Crane's office will be issuing a formal computation. But my working estimate, he named a figure that was less than a third of what the notice had claimed, is in that range. Mara put her hands flat on the table. She didn't say anything for a moment. That's manageable, Rowan said quietly from across the room. That's manageable, she agreed. Her voice came out steady, which required some effort, because it was also, in a specific and private way, devastating to learn that the number that had kept her awake since October, the number she'd turned over in the dark 300 times and never found a way to reach, was not the real number. That someone had manufactured her despair, made it larger than it needed to be on purpose, to break her at a specific point, in a specific way, so that she'd lose what she'd built. She breathed out slowly. When will we know for certain? She asked. A few weeks for the formal computation. The freeze is in place, so your title is not at risk in the meantime. The auction is indefinitely suspended pending the investigation. Mercer folded his hands. Crane is confident this moves forward. He told me last night that this is the clearest case of coordinated county-level fraud his office has seen, and that the documentation, particularly your daughter's analysis of the loan compound clause, is going to be specifically useful in the bank investigation. Mara looked at Tess, who was sitting in the corner with the account book and the expression of a person who had been told something pleasing and was trying not to let it show too much. Tess, Mara said. I heard. Tess said. Are you going to be insufferable about it? Pause. Probably a little bit, Tess admitted. The next 3 weeks were the strangest Mara had ever lived through, and that included the weeks after Daniel died, which had their own particular strangeness. She'd expected the aftermath of the courthouse to feel like resolution, and instead it felt like a new kind of waiting, a better kind. A waiting with more ground under it, but waiting nonetheless. Mercer stayed through Christmas, working with Crane's investigators, and Rowan stayed because there was work to do at the property. And also, Mara suspected, because leaving had not yet become something either of them was ready for. Christmas itself was a small, quiet thing. There was no money for presents, which Mara had already explained to the children in October, and they had received this information with varying degrees of stoicism. Cal immediately practical about it, Lottie briefly disappointed, and then redirected, Tess pretending she'd expected it, even though her face had said otherwise. What they had was the salt pork and dried beans, and the good flour, and Mara made a meal that was better than they'd had in months. And Rowan disappeared into town on the morning of December 24th and came back with 2 things, a small bag of sugar and somehow 3 oranges, which was an outright marvel in January in Montana, and which Mara couldn't begin to explain and didn't try to. Lottie held her orange for approximately 10 minutes, turning it in her small hands and smelling it, before she ate it with the dedicated concentration of someone performing a ritual. Rowan sat across the table and watched her do it, and his face had an expression on it that Mara caught once and then looked away from because it was not the kind of thing you observed directly. "Where did you find oranges?" Cal asked him. "The general store had them." "The general store never has oranges." "They had them today." Cal looked at him with the same expression he'd use on a fence that wasn't where the map said it should be. "You're not telling me how you actually got them." "I'm telling you I got them at the general store," Rowan said with perfect composure. "That's different from telling me how." Mara watched this exchange from across the table and felt something warm and complicated move through her, and she looked down at her own orange and focused on peeling it because the something warm and complicated was getting harder to manage in the general direction of her face. The formal investigation moved with what Mercer called unusual speed for a territorial proceeding, which meant that within 6 weeks they had preliminary rulings on 3 of the most clear-cut cases, the families whose situations were so completely documented that even a cautious court couldn't delay. The Fowler brothers got their claim restored. Petra Sands's assessment was formally invalidated. Martin Heck received a determination that the transfer of his wife's property had been effected through a fraudulent auction process and that he was entitled to restoration of the deed or full market value compensation. He chose the deed. When Ada Crowley told Mara about Heck's choice, sitting at Mara's kitchen table on a February afternoon with the light coming through the window at the particular angle it only hit in late winter, Eza said it the same way. She said everything without embellishment, just the fact of it. And then she was quiet for a moment, which for Ada meant something, because Ada was not a woman who used silence carelessly. "He walked back out to that land," Ada said, "the day after the determination came through. Just walked out there in the snow and stood in the middle of his wife's pasture for about an hour." She paused. His neighbor's boy saw him, said he just stood there. Mara didn't say anything. "Sometimes the right thing happening is so overdue," Ada said, "that it doesn't feel like relief. It just feels like something settling back into place that should never have been moved." Mara thought about that for a long time afterward. Rourke's formal removal from the county judgeship came in late February through a territorial proceeding that Crane's office had been building since January. He didn't fight it publicly, which surprised some people, and didn't surprise Mara at all, because she'd looked at his face on those courthouse steps on December 23rd, and she'd seen the precise moment when a man who had built his life on controlling information realized that the information had gotten away from him. Men like Rourke didn't fight in the open. They were built for closed rooms and quiet paperwork, for processes that ran behind other processes. The open air was not his element, and he knew it. He was facing criminal charges. The shell company scheme, the fraudulent assessments, the bank loan clause Crane's office had assembled a case that Mercer described, with restrained professional approval, as comprehensive. Whether Rourke would ultimately serve time was something Mara held loosely, because she'd told Tess the truth about that, and she meant to keep believing it herself. Courts take time, Powerful men have resources, and sometimes things don't end the way they should. But his power in the county was gone. That was real. That was finished. The fear that had let him operate the sense, in each isolated family, that the system belonged to him and fighting it was pointless was gone. Because 25 families had stood on courthouse steps together, and that image did not go away. It moved through the valley the way important images do, attached to specific people's stories, passed from one conversation to the next at general stores and crossroads and kitchen tables. The story of Blackthorn Crossing became, in the valley's telling of it, the story of where it started. Mara was not entirely comfortable with this. She was a practical woman who understood that she had not set out to be anyone's symbol. She'd set out to keep her house, but she understood it, and she didn't fight it, because stories have their own motion, and you can't always steer them. Her deed was formally confirmed in March, the mortgage recomputed and settled through the partnership funds in a transaction that Mercer structured carefully, with both Mara's and Rowan's names on the papers, in the proportions they'd agreed on that January morning over scrambled eggs. Her land. Her name first. She stood in Mercer's temporary office at the hotel, holding the confirmed deed, and she felt the weight of the paper, which was not heavy at all, a single sheet, barely anything. And she thought about Daniel digging the irrigation channel in the summer heat, 2 summers, running by hand. She thought about the 2 uneven pieces of log in the snow on the morning this had started, and the soup she'd scraped from the bottom of the pot, and the door she'd opened into the dark with a poker in her hand. She folded the deed carefully, put it in her coat pocket, walked out of the hotel into the March air, which was still cold but had something different in it. The first faint suggestion of something underneath the cold that would eventually become spring. Rowan was waiting outside with the buckboard. She climbed up. They rode in silence for a while. "It's done," he said. "Not a question." "It's done," she said. He nodded, kept his eyes on the road. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the cattle. You said 30 head to start. I've been looking at the eastern pasture, and I think we could carry 40 if we rebuild the north fence before summer, which we could do in April." She paused. "Also, that needs a new roof section before the spring rains, or we're going to spend June bailing out the stalls. And there are 3 fence posts on the south boundary that are rotted through at the ground." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of work." "Yes, you're not asking me if I want to do it. You're my partner," she said. "Partner's work. I'm telling you what the work is." He looked sideways at her. Something in his face was doing a thing she'd noticed, did sometimes, a kind of careful stillness that was different from his natural reserve. The stillness of a man choosing deliberately not to show a thing rather than a man who isn't feeling it. "All right," he said. "The north fence first, then the barn roof. And the posts. And the posts." They rode the rest of the way back to Blackthorn Crossing without talking about it further, because neither of them was a person who needed to say more than what needed saying. Spring came late, as it always did in that country, arriving in fits and starts with false beginnings and retreats, snow in early April that made Mara briefly murderous and then melted inside a week. But it came. The ground opened up slowly, reluctantly, giving back the smell of itself after months of cold, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the eastern pasture went from white to brown to something hinting at green, in a process that was slow and not dramatic, but was, in the way of all genuine things, reliable. Rowan brought the cattle in the 2nd week of April. Not 30, and not 40-33, which was what he'd found at a fair price from a ranch 2 counties north, which was in Mara's view the correct outcome, because 33 was a number that came from actual conditions rather than from someone's idea of what sounded right. She'd told him her parameters: breed, age range, health standards, price ceiling, and he'd gone and applied them without trying to improve on them, which she found, quietly, to be one of the more significant things about him. Cattle came through the north gate on a Tuesday afternoon, 33 head moving in that rolling, slightly chaotic way cattle move when they're in new terrain, and Cal was on the fence watching with an expression of focused concentration that made him look exactly like Daniel, which hit Mara somewhere in the sternum and stayed there. Lottie was beside him, smaller, equally focused, with a piece of biscuit in one hand that she'd forgotten to finish eating, because the cattle were more interesting. Rowan and the 2 ranch hands he'd hired, local men, brothers named Dustin and Kip Morales, who knew the valley and whose family had been in the territory for 20 years and who had their own reasons for wanting to work. For someone who wasn't connected to Rourke's old network, came through last, movitsni and the stragglers. Tess was at the gate, writing in the account book. She had a new one now. Mara had bought it specifically because the old one was full, every page covered with the evidence of what they'd been through, and it deserved to be kept as it was. The new one was for what came next. 33, Tess said, counting. You said 30. I know what I said, Rowan said, pulling up beside her. The 3 were a good price and good quality, and it would have been wasteful to leave them. So you went over budget. By the cost of 3 animals. Yes. Tess looked at him over the account book with an expression that was assessing and slightly amused in equal measure. I'm noting it, she said. You do that, Rowan said without apparent concern. Mara, watching this from the porch, felt something that had no precise word for it, or maybe had too many a warmth, a complicated and slightly painful fullness, the feeling of a moment you know you will remember for the rest of your life, because it has the specific texture of something that is real rather than wished for. Dustin and Kip turned out to be excellent hands. They arrived each morning at 6 and worked through until the light went, and they had a practical fluency with cattle and fence and general ranch logistics that meant Rowan could plan the overall work without having to be everywhere at once. Which had been Mara's were dark, which had been Marat's private concern that the operation would be too much for 2 people, that they'd built a plan on paper that wouldn't hold up against the actual physical weight of a working ranch. It held up. Not easily, and not without problems, the barn roof took 2 weeks longer than expected, because one of the crossbeams was worse than they'd thought, and there was a week in May when 3 cattle came down with something that Rowan treated with practiced competence, but that cost them sleep and worry regardless. And Lottie fell out of a tree in June and broke her wrist, which was not a ranch problem, but was absolutely a problem, but it held up. There were evenings in June when Mara sat on the repaired porch in the warm light and looked at the pasture and the fence line and the barn, with its new roof section and the cattle moving in the long summer evening, and she let herself believe it was real. She'd been careful about that, about believing things were real before she had sufficient evidence. It was a habit of protection, developed over a long time, that she was slowly discovering was also a habit of deprivation. Because some things were real, some things held, and refusing to let yourself believe that was not wisdom, it was just fear wearing wisdom's clothes. One evening in late June, Rowan came and sat beside her on the porch without being asked, which she'd started doing sometime in May, and which she'd stopped finding something she needed to think about. They sat for a while. The air smelled like grass and warm wood and somewhere distant water. I want to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I walked away from the Hale Cattle Company, he stopped, started over. After Purcell, when I found out what he'd done, the thing that hit hardest wasn't the money, or even the betrayal exactly. It was that I'd spent 12 years building something, and I thought I knew what I'd built. I thought I understood it, and then I found out I'd been wrong about the most important part of it, which was who was standing next to me. He looked out at the pasture. I told myself I left to look for proof that people were still decent, and that was true partly. But it was also I was afraid to build anything again, to stand next to someone again and have it matter. He paused. I'm not afraid of that anymore. Mara looked at the cattle moving in the evening light. I know, she said. I wanted to say it plainly, I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. I've been afraid of the same thing. Different reasons. But the same thing, she glanced at him. I still am some of the time. I'm not going to tell you I'm not. That's fair. I'm telling you that I'm afraid of it, and I'm doing it anyway, she said, because that's the only honest version of not being afraid. He turned to look at her. She looked back. There wasn't a dramatic moment, no proclamation, no gesture that would have looked good from a distance. Just 2 people on a porch in the June evening, looking at each other with clear eyes, and the full knowledge of what the other person was complicated, stubborn, scarred in specific ways by specific things, neither of them remotely what you'd pick if you were picking from a description rather than from experience. And that was, Mara thought, exactly right. Because the things that lasted weren't the things that were easy from the beginning. They were the things you built out of what was actually there, in the actual conditions, with the actual people, making the actual mistakes, and choosing to keep going anyway. She'd learned that from Daniel first, and she'd almost lost it when she lost him, and she was not entirely sure she'd have found it again without the winter that had just passed, without the specific pressure of everything she'd stood to lose, which had forced her to discover what she was actually capable of and who she was actually willing to become. Tess appeared in the doorway behind them. "Cal won't stop arguing with Dustin about the south fence line," she reported. "Who's right?" Mara asked. "Cal, actually. But Dustin's older, so he's not listening. Tell Cal to write it down and show it to Rowan in the morning," Mara said. "If he's right, Rowan will handle it." Tess relayed this, apparently satisfied, and disappeared back inside. A moment later, her voice floated back out, telling Cal something in the firm, slightly impatient tone she'd developed for when she had to explain things twice. Rowan was watching Mara with that look he had, the careful, attending look. "Going to run something someday," he said. "I know," Mara said. "She already runs things. She just doesn't have enough things yet." By midsummer, Blackthorn Crossing was not profitable. That was the honest answer, and Mara was always as honest about the answers. It was not losing money either, which, for a first-year ranch operating in a county that had been systematically gutted by institutional corruption, was something to respect. Mercer had structured the partnership finances carefully, and the combination of Rowan's capital and the first summer's cattle revenue meant they'd covered the operating costs without touching the emergency reserve that Mara had insisted on maintaining, that because she was never again going to be in a position where 18 was the total distance between her family and nothing. She'd told Rowan this when they'd set up the finances, and he'd nodded without argument, which had been exactly the right response. In August, Mara received a letter from Gideon Mercer. The territorial court had issued its ruling on the consolidated fraud case, the full case. All 25 families, all 3 shell companies. Rourke's assets, including his interest in the First Territorial Bank's Holt County branch, had been frozen, pending the criminal proceeding. Ellis Croft had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges, which meant the full internal mechanics of the scheme were now on record. Court had ordered the restoration of all properties still held by the shell companies and had established a compensation fund drawn from the frozen assets for families whose land had been resold to third parties who couldn't themselves be held accountable for the fraud. Mercer added, in the final paragraph, in language slightly less formal than the rest of the letter, that the compound interest clause case had been settled against the bank, that the bank had agreed to recompute all affected loans at the correct rate, and that the net refund owed to affected borrowers across the county was a number that would make, he wrote, somewhat meaningful restitution for what they'd been through. He also noted that Tess's margin analysis had been specifically cited in the court's written determination on the loan clause. Mara read this paragraph to Tess at the kitchen table. Tess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I have a copy of the determination?" "I'll write," Mercer Mara said. "I want to show Ada." Mara looked at her daughter. "Ada would want to know," Tess said, slightly defensive. "Part of this." "She was," Mara agreed. "Write Ada yourself. Mercer will send the determination to both of us." Tess pulled the account book toward her and opened it and picked up her pencil. Ada Crowley received the letter at the end of August and sent back a reply that was, for Ada, almost effusive 4 full paragraphs instead of her usual 2, with an observation in the 3rd paragraph that Tess Vance was going to be a force of nature and that Mara should make sure she knew it. Mara showed it to Tess. "I already know it," Tess said. "I know you do," Mara said, "but it helps to hear it from Ada." Tess considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "Yes," she said finally. "It does." The fall came and the cattle did well, and Dustin and Kip were good workers who were becoming something more like members of the operation than employees, which Mara and Rowan discussed and decided to formalize in a small way that cost them something but felt right, which was usually the sign that something actually was right. Cal turned windows were dark. Cal turned 9 in October. He'd been doing more and more of the morning barn work on his own, with a growing competence that Dustin had apparently noticed and mentioned to Rowan, who'd mentioned it to Mara with the particular care of someone who understood that she might have feelings about it. She did have feelings about it. They were complicated and mostly good. Cal didn't sleep with the hammer anymore. It lived on the shelf above his cot, which was a different thing, not anxious, Not defensive, just where it belonged, beside him in the way a belonging sits beside a person rather than a weapon sits in a hand. She'd moved Daniel's coat off the hook by the door in September. Not away she'd hung it in the back of the wardrobe, where it would stay, but off the hook by the door, because that hook was for coats that were in use, and she'd understood somewhere in the summer that it was time to let it mean that again. One evening in late October, Rowan came in from the pasture at dusk and found Mara at the kitchen table, not working, just sitting with the lamp lit and a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. Came and sat across from her and didn't ask what she was thinking about, which was correct, because she was thinking about too many things to summarize. She looked at him. This man who had collapsed in her doorway with blood on his coat and a gold watch in his pocket and a face full of things he was not yet willing to say, who had gone out in the snow with a wound in his side because her daughter was sick and he had decided that that was what the night required of him, who had come back across the mountains in the dark with a lawyer and a document case and 3 days to spare, who had since March been showing up every morning with the same unhurried reliability, the way the sun shows up, not dramatic, not conditional, just there. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She changed her mind. "A lot of things," she said. "The winter. How fast it came last year and how wrong-footed we were." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "I want to have 4 months of firewood laid in before the first snow. I know. Dustin and I were planning to start next week. I want a root cellar addition on the north side of the barn. For the winter feed, I've been thinking the same thing. I was going to bring it up. I know you were." She looked at him. "We think about the same problems." "We do," he said. "That's useful." "It's more than useful," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprised she didn't surprise him much anymore, and he didn't surprise her much either, which was different from how it had been in January, and which she valued more than she would have thought possible when she hadn't yet known what it felt like. "Yes," he said, "it is." The first snow of that winter came on a Tuesday in November, which was earlier than last year and lighter, just a few inches, the kind of snow that Mara had long ago decided was the land's way of practicing. She stood on the porch and watched it come down and felt the difference between this November and last. The firewood was in, genuinely in, enough of it that she felt the stored warmth of it just knowing it was there. The root cellar was dug and stocked. The cattle were in good condition and had proper winter shelter. The finances were in order, not comfortable, but in order, which was what she'd asked for when she'd asked for anything at all. Lottie came out and stood beside her in her coat and boots, wrist-heeled, and looked at the snow with the absolute openness of 5 going on 6. "It's pretty," Lottie said. "It is," Mara agreed. "Last year you were sad when the snow came." Mara looked down at her. "I was worried," she said. "That's different from sad." "Is it?" She thought about it honestly, which Lottie's questions usually required. "Sometimes," she said. "Last year it was." She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "This year I'm just cold." Lottie laughed her real laugh, the one that had no performance in it, and leaned against Mara's side. From inside the house came the sound of Cal's voice, asking Rowan something about the south fence, and Rowan's voice answering, and then Tess's voice cutting in with a correction that was probably accurate, and then Cal arguing about it, and then Lottie's head turned toward the sound, and she said, "I'm going in," and went. Most of its windows were dark. Mara stayed on the porch for another minute. She thought about what she'd told Tess in the buckboard, coming back from the courthouse in December, that things don't end. They just change what they are. She still believed that. She believed it differently now, because she'd watched it play out over the course of a year with enough specificity to understand what it meant. The thing that had happened last winter hadn't ended. It was still happening, in the way that the things that reshape you keep happening, in the changed shape of the barn roof and the new pages in the account book, and the way Cal set the hammer on the shelf instead of the floor, and the way Tess held a pencil like a tool instead of a permission. Most of its windows were dark. In the root cellar on the north side of the barn, and the 30 cattle in the pasture, and Gideon Mercer's letter in the drawer, and Martin Heck standing in his wife's pasture for an hour in the snow. In the man sitting at her kitchen table, answering her son's questions about a fence line, as though this were simply, naturally, where he was supposed to be. She had not gone looking for any of this. She'd gone looking for willow bark for a sick child and firewood for a cold house. and some way anyway to hold on to 160 acres of frozen Montana ground that she'd earned by the specific and particular method of refusing to let it go. What she'd found in the process was harder to say. Not a rescue. She was particular about that. Nobody had rescued her. What had happened was more complicated and more true than rescue. She had done the work with everything she had, and someone had chosen to do the work beside her, and most of it's dark, and the work had turned out to be bigger than either of them could have done alone. She didn't know if that was luck or logic, or just the way things sometimes fell when you kept your door open, even when the night was cold, and the stranger on your doorstep had too many secrets, and you had too little to spare. She suspected it was some of all three, mixed in proportions she'd never be able to separate. The snow was falling quietly, covering the yard in a thin, even layer, the fence posts wearing it, the pasture going white again. She was warm. Her children were inside. The firewood was in. She went back through the door and closed it behind her.